The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
The chat pod itself, just to make sure that there are no underlying issues that are pending there. So we've gone ahead and started the broadcast. Thank you everybody for joining us today. Sorry for the bit of technical difficulties on our end. We are going to go ahead and start the session though. My name is Nathan Hicks. Thank you all for joining us today. This is the first session in the 2020 Conversations with Colleagues. One moment, I'll share my screen here. Are you all able to see on my screen now?
Yes.
Great. Good. Let me go ahead and put this in this view. Excellent. All right. So today, thank you for joining us in the Conversations with Colleagues sessions. This is the first one in the series of the 2020 series. It's being hosted by the TRB Bicycle and Pedestrian Data Subcommittee, and these sessions take place every third Tuesday of every third month, and they're focused on challenges and issues surrounding bicycle and pedestrian traffic monitoring. Today's session specifically will focus on emerging non-motorized transportation data sources and how to best utilize them. As again, my name is Nathan Hicks. We also have Tony Hull and Wen Sheng as host, and our two panelists today are Sean Koh, who is the director of the special projects at Streetlight Data, as well as Bahar Dadashova, who is an interdisciplinary safety researcher at Texas A&M Transportation Institute. So a few quick ground rules today, just to let everyone know. If you have any questions, be sure to put them in the question pod, so that way at the end of each of these panelist sessions, we can have them answered. If you have a question that you would like to speak, instead of trying to type it out, if perhaps it's a very long question, be sure to raise your hand and we'll be sure to call on you once the Q&A starts for each of the panelists. If you have any other IT issues or anything along the lines of that, be sure to type it into the chat pod, so that way we can try and address that while the session is taking place. As again, Tony and Wen will be monitoring the questions as they come in, and they'll be monitoring them and making sure that they're answered during the Q&A portion. And following the webinar, we'll also be providing a summary, which will include links, references, and any other information that was discussed during the session today itself, as well as recording. As mentioned earlier, today's session will be to review some of the new emerging non-motorized transportation data sources that are out there and available to everybody, to researchers, and to local officials. Without further ado, I will go ahead and turn it over to Sean Koh and for his presentation and the Q&A. And just give me one moment, Sean, as I go ahead and make you the presenter here. All right, take it away, Sean.
Okay, great, thanks, Nathan. Can everyone see my screen okay?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay.
It's showing your desktop.
All right, can you see the presentation?
Yes, now we can.
Okay.
Great, thank you.
Great, so yeah, thanks for inviting me here. We had a great session at TRB with a lot of the same people that you'll see on the panel today. And that was a great 4-hour session with all sorts of data. I'm just gonna quickly talk about kind of the data that we have and what we've done for validation and how we could get help from all of you in the field to help us validate our data. So first off, Streetlight Data, we get our data from aggregated and anonymized location-based services from providers, and then we incorporate that into a platform. I just have a couple, I'm not going to go into everything on this slide, but these are just sort of the questions that you should ask yourselves, when you're looking at data. Where does the data come from? What are the sources? What's the processing methods? What privacy protections are in place? And then what's the validation and uses of that data? We have we have a lot of this information on our website, and also the names of our providers, where we get the data from, as well as white papers for any of the stuff that I'll discuss. So I'm going to talk specifically about the methods and validation. How do you know it's walk or bike trips? So we take all of the pings from location-based services and put that into an algorithm that is determining the probability that that's either a walk or bike trip based on the trip characteristics, speed, profile, etc. And then we put those into a machine learning algorithm, which is called random forest, in order to determine how those trips, those cell phone pings convert into trips. You'll note that the stationary is also a mode, which we don't sense that ping has moved more than 5 meters in 5 minutes. We break the trip. So that's important because we count trips differently than other sources of transportation data that's a little bit that you guys are all familiar with. So what we did was we compared our trips and compared that to the National Household Travel Survey, as well as other statewide surveys, like California as an example, but I'm just going to talk about NHTS in this quick slide. So in the same period, 2017, we had 692,000 points in our sample compared to NHTS, which had about 8,000. And one thing that we noticed is we picked up a lot of the shorter trips, less than a half mile and mile, and that's really because of that trip breaking criteria that I've described. And those short trips, as you're well aware, are also very important to planners because they tend to be underreported in any self-report survey. The other way that we validate our data is we compare that to known, ground truth data when possible. So one of the best sources on a sort of region-wide scale is the ones from San Francisco MTA, which maintains a large network of permanent continuous counters, mostly eco counters that are installed in various areas in San Francisco. And we compared that with what we find in our sample and showed correlation between the trips of about 0.81 for weekdays for the same months that we analyzed, which was generally kind of spring to summer months, and found a very strong correlation between the two data sets.
John,
Yeah.
Can I for just a second?
Yeah.
Tomas is asking if you could give a little bit more background and clarify, is this exclusively cell phone signal data that you're speaking of?
No, so it is, we're not using cell phone data because the spatial precision isn't high enough in order to locate a point. So we're using just location-based services where you have opt-in only apps. So an example of that would be like a weather app where you load it onto your phone, you say, I allow this device to use my location either always or when you're using the app, and then there's like a consent screen after that. And our supplier Cubic then takes they take all those apps, aggregate them, and then they supply that to us. So we're using essentially the GPS portion of the location-based service.
Thanks, Sean.
Yeah, that actually was all I had on the validation methods. I'd be happy to answer any other questions.
Sure, I'll remind our audience if they have some questions, they can type those in, we'll respond. One question here, Sean. Working with external data in general, do you have advice for how agencies can assess confidence for external data sources when communicating this to stakeholders and decision makers?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and a question we get a lot. The first thing is, either in an emerging data source like location-based services or any other traditional method, you should first go through the proper procedures in order to calibrate your equipment, and then look at that data over time. So particularly for bike and ped counting, there's some great resources out there that probably many on this call have participated or authored, like NCHRP 797, which describes how you could, the importance of basically having site-specific calibration factors and calibrating the equipment and maintaining it, particularly with either like temporary continuous counters that like a street sweeper doesn't come and sort of break the hose and you have to go out and install it. So that's the first thing, is to understand what you're comparing it against. The second thing is how what sources has that data provider used to validate it. If it's like in our case, we've used where we can get them, our bike counters and survey data, and how does that compare and how does that sort of match just the general sniff test, and also sort of what from on the ground planning. But I think it's an important question, and back to that first slide that I had about knowing where the data comes from, what's the validation methods, and what's the commitment to privacy. All are questions that you should be asking when you're looking at different data.
Great, thanks, Sean. There's another question just came in from Elizabeth Stolz. Correlations are great, but if you looked at any point-specific validation methods, and for example, comparing a point of data collection with instrumentation on the ground at that point?
Wait, what was, could you repeat, Tony?
It's really looking at, the correlations are good, but do you have examples of doing a comparison with a actual point collection, ground data?
Like comparing a trip to another trip, sort of.
Yeah,
thing?
What Liz is getting at, and I hope I'm clarifying okay, comparing a specific point with the actual device, a counter or observed counts.
Yeah, so we have done that. So we've provided that data. We've done that ourselves, and we've provided to other researchers, like TTI has done those comparisons where you've looked at a particular counter location and our data and what that volume is, on a particular like average for a month, as an example. So we have done that before. I thought Liz's question was perhaps asking how would that compare to specific trips, like if you had, GPS survey data that you had like from any of the national or statewide household travel surveys where you had a GPS data logger. Now that compares. We haven't done that specific comparison for obvious reasons due to low sample size, et cetera. But the counter comparison at specific locations we have done.
Excellent. I think that gets to it, Liz. I'll ask Liz if she needs more information to chime in again. Another question from Hewlin Lay at Ohio State. How many cities or metro areas and years in the US does the Streetlight data account for?
So, yeah, so we like to say, on average, we have about a quarter of the adult population in the US, and we have data going back to 2017. And that's data really on any road. When you look at the data that you download it from the platform, you can look at the device counts. So any of the metrics you can look at and see what that looks like on the particular area that you're trying to analyze. But yeah, we generally say that we have data for every location in the US.
Excellent. And then Shannon Glendenning asked, has this data been validated in rural areas?
Yeah, great question. We have a lot for vehicles, particularly for AADP in rural areas. We have looked at that a little bit, particularly in California and some of the more rural Caltrans districts. However, it's been difficult because of the lack of data on which to validate. So where we've asked, they've said, great, we've got turning movement counts, for 2-hour period, that was taken 5 years ago, and it's, for obvious reasons, very difficult to validate against that. But yeah, if you know of any in rural areas, yeah, we'd love to help provide that validation.
Excellent. And another question from Tomas Goci. Where does the mode detection take place, year end or higher up, in parentheses cubic? Are these algorithms open or proprietary, and what is their accuracy?
Yeah, so the data suppliers are just providing us with the raw location-based service pings, and then our algorithm is taking into account the frequency of the ping location, and we're using that on that that bubble slide that I showed, which was an example of like a decision tree, which is like that's run through the algorithm, which is not proprietary. It's random forest algorithm is what we use for this example, and it's just making a bunch of comparisons, like thousands of them to determine the mode from that. And does it, does this ping look like a bike trip? Does this ping look like a walk trip? And in terms of accuracy, we, again, that's back to the validation pieces, how we validate to as accurate of data that we can get. So counters, survey data, et cetera. So yeah.
Excellent. And then another question for you, Sean, and maybe I'll check to make sure we're still on time. Let me know if we're running a little long. In terms of, as this data expands, thinking longitudinally, the quality of data should improve over time, but also like the depth and breadth of the data will sort of change in accuracy. How do we account for sort of making these longitudinal comparisons as we start to get a more robust data set?
Yeah, good question. So we do have a metric which that we call our index value, and it attempts to normalize the data across, like for population and for the number of devices. So it's a way to take that into account. And like I said, you can also look at sample size.
Excellent. And I'm looking here. I'm not seeing any other questions, so we'll give a few seconds if anybody else has questions they'd like to offer up for Sean before we move to the second presenter. Give everybody a couple seconds, I guess.
Yes, we still have plenty of time, so no rush. If anyone has any questions, I actually do have a question, Sean, in regards to the validation. And I'm seeing here, at least for this particular screen, it's showing for weekdays. I'm assuming there's been validation for weekends. What about has there been any variation in terms of like time of day? Has that been found to be a factor, or have you looked at it in that particular way?
Yeah, obviously it's hard to. Well, let me answer your first question. So weekends, yes, and there's a white paper on that which we can send out after we're done. Yeah, it's time of day we've also done too. So you can it's not. We did a project with Caltrans here in California, the state DOT, and we did provide the what the trend over a particular week is, for them. So weekday by sort of hour.
Great. It's great to know. Well, we don't have any other questions at the moment, but if anyone else has a question that is kind of.
Hey, Sean, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Wen.
Yeah, okay, good. This is Wen Chen from Cal Poly. Actually, I think one of the major problems associated with the crowdsourcing is the sample size issue, because not everybody will hold the cell phone or the app, right? So did you have you ever considered the systematic bias associated with those sampling bias,
Yeah, great question. So we have looked at that, and where we do see biases is on really how we do our privacy, and so that's where we don't take any devices for children under 13. And then also we have, can show some bias for older adults who, while they do have smartphones, are less likely to have location-based services installed and running on their smartphones. Generally in the US, about 82% of adults have smartphones and with location-based services, but when we looked at it, stratified by those categories, it didn't look that different, but that is something that we have noted, and it doesn't make a huge difference in the data.
Okay, sounds great. I have another follow-up question regarding the mode detection. For the mode detection, I noticed that you folks use the random forest, which has been a very good method for the classification issues. Perfect application for mode detection. But have you ever considered upgrading the algorithm, like deep learning or some other method with more accuracy?
Yeah, so we do look every time we get new data. We actually test different algorithms to see which one works the best in our particular application. And yeah, while random forest isn't like the latest greatest thing, it is still tests the best given the spatial precision, the frequency of the pings, and everything else that we have.
Okay, thank you.
A couple more questions have trickled in from our audience. Tomas is writing in again. A little curious, I guess, if you could expand a little bit more about your company's open source philosophy. He said he was just sort of perusing and reading a little bit in the website. Could you elaborate on that a little bit, Sean?
Well, yeah, I mean, the open source part is really that we disclose who our suppliers are, our algorithms, the calibration and all that stuff. And we have, Cubic is not the only one. We have other suppliers which are listed on the website. And we also do commercial vehicles. So we list those too, which is Interix, and then SafeGraph and a few others. When we get them, we'll update them. But yeah, it's really like, in terms of open source, we'll tell you how we do it. We tell you the methods, and when you run everything in the platform, we give you the raw data, to use. In terms of that, there are a few secret sauce things that we don't disclose, but everything else, if you want to know how we do something, not just for mode detection, but for vehicle stuff, we have white papers, which we're happy to share with anyone.
Oh, sure, thanks. And then Steve Jesper has typed in and wondered, were any of the SFMTA sites calibrated for known accuracy?
Yeah, good question, Steve. So they had done that in the past. Their counter program is kind of a program that is run with the really great help of interns. So I think when they're first installed, but in terms of the calibration of those on an ongoing basis, I don't know. When I talked to the MTA staff, in particular Jamie Parks, who of course is the chair of the bike committee, he thinks some count locations are much better than others, and some counters are, they have their doubts about, but they haven't gone out and done a systematic check that you would, like in the NCHRP that I mentioned, and other papers that Tony has helped with, where you validate using other methods, video, hand counts, etc. So I think they did that when they first got them. They're all eco counters, I believe, but as everyone's well aware, you still have to check them out as conditions on the road can change.
Yep, maybe we can follow up with someone at SFMTA and get a little bit more on that after the webinar, because that's an interesting question.
Yep.
Hey, Sean, one more question. I noticed you have done some validation based on SFMTA and the Washington, D.C. data, but have you get a chance to validate other data source like Poland, or Southern California, the SCAC, they have the active data database, right?
Right. Yep.
Yeah.
So we have looked at those, and we would like to use, permanent continuous counters. So if you're using short counters with expansion factors, that's for obvious reasons not great. So the SCAG ones is a mixed bag. Same with San Diego's. They do have some permanent counters. There we have looked at other places, but I think some of this that has been done not by us, but we supply the data, is TTI compared our data to a lot of counters in Texas and found very similar correlations as well. And I'm not as familiar with which counters they used in Texas, but they had a good distribution of those counters.
Okay. So for the high correlation from your department or from TTI, but does that high correlation consider the systematic bias like the crowdsourcing data bias already, or before that?
So you'll if you talk to TTI, they looked at I believe they looked at sort of trying to determine which trips were sort of everyday trips and which were recreational. They also looked at Strava data to see how both Strava data compared to their counters and our data compared to counters, and then Strava data compared to our data. Strava data is a crowdsourced opt-in only app, which you have to select and turn it on, where ours is we're passively receiving information. So so in terms of where they see and expect bike activity in certain neighborhoods, assuming that those neighborhoods represent a cross section of the different socioeconomic backgrounds, they found correlation between those counter locations. As to on an individual level, I think that'd be hard because we don't provide individual level data. But on a neighborhood level, I think they found that it was fairly representative.
Thank you for your clarification.
I have a follow-up from Stephen Jesberger. So is it known if any occlusion or weather factors were applied? And I'm assuming he's speaking to the SFMTA data that was used. Hopefully I'm right.
Yes, Stephen. Let's see. So we just took the, as raw of the count data as they had available to us. In their annual report, they do account for probably weather, but not necessarily for occlusion. Again, this is for bike. The occlusion is is a bigger difference with infrared counters, because I think that these were mostly loop detectors. So on the eco counters, loop detector, it's looking at as a bike passes over the detector, versus video, where if you're riding side by side or walking side by side, that's when the occlusion could occur, or with video. But in this case, I believe it was loop detectors.
Yeah, that's good clarification, Sean. A good question. I think the key there would be we really wouldn't want to look at weather factors, because we want to look at how it's both collecting data, but the occlusion could be important, because if it's a known occlusion in terms of trying to compare the two, it would be useful to include that data. Yes.
Yes, I don't think. Well, we didn't see that they had any sort of that they noted like that. Whatever 5% of the time there's some occlusion, with bikes or whatever else, but we didn't see that from them.
Thanks, Sean. And Nathan, we're at half an hour, so I don't know. I'm not seeing another question coming in. Are we ready to? Should we be going to presentations?
Yeah, this is the perfect time. So we'll go ahead and have Bahar go ahead and present. Sean, thank you very much. That was very insightful. So Bahar, I'm going to go ahead and make you the presenter now. And whenever you're ready.
Hello, everyone. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, that's great. I'm going to, well, is this better?
That's perfect.
I'm going to, this down. Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to this, to the workshop. Can you also see this small box on my screen, or is it just me who is seeing
No,
it?
that is only you can see that.
Only, okay, great.
No problem.
So as Sean mentioned, we had a workshop this year at TRB on making sense of emerging data sources and for non-motorized transportation. And in this presentation, I just wanted to go ahead and give a brief summary of what went on in this workshop. Here's the announcement for the workshop. As you can see, we had people from data providers, we had panelists from the data providers, practitioners, and the researchers to talk about how they are using the crowdsourced data for decision-making and policy-making, and to discuss what were the data needs and what were the lessons learned from data gaps and privacy issues. We had several committees sponsoring this workshop. You can find I've provided the website here where you can see the agenda. We're still working on the summary. We're trying to put together a summary for to show the results, like the discussions of the workshop, and hopefully it will appear here soon. We had the workshop had consist of 3 panels. In the first panel, we had the presenter, the panelists from the state DOTs and practitioners to discuss how they are using the emerging data sources for policy decision making. And the second panel, we had researchers. It was mainly researchers and the data providers to discuss how the emerging data sources were used in data for transportation data analytics. And they also discussed the data needs and analysis methods. And we had the third panel consisting of mainly the data providers to talk about the data gaps and privacy issues and the lessons they had learned. And finally, we had the fourth panel to discuss the cross-cutting issues. It was mainly, we had some questions for all the panelists. We also received some questions from the attendees. And of course, this workshop wouldn't be possible without the help of this great team you can see here. We had overall, I believe, 20 something people just together with the moderator and panelists organizing the workshop. And although it was a Thursday workshop, we had really good attendance. And so in the next slides, I'm just going to go and discuss briefly what the panelists discussed at every panel, like discussions. As you will see, I'm not going to show any graphs or tables. It's because some of the panelists that shared their presentations, they had concerns about sharing their slides, and I did not really ask for permission, so I decided not to show any specific examples, but just an overall discussions what went on during each panel meeting. As I said, the first panel consists of the state DOT, policymakers, and practitioners. We had panelists from Populous, Virginia DOT, Convent, Moveit, and Remix to discuss their experience and how they are using the emerging data for policy practice and policy making. We heard from the Virginia DOT that they are using this data for to monitor the bicycle activity by census tract or block groups in Virginia. And they are also looking at the density of short vehicle trips to prioritize the projects. We actually heard in other discussions also that this type of crowdsourced data are really good source for looking at the short vehicle trips. In general, short trips. We had the practitioners to discuss, and these are like private companies. They are using the crowdsourced data to develop tools and platforms which they provide the cities with to help them for decision making. Some of the great examples we heard were, for example, on the Populous, how they were using the data in general for bike share and scooter share planning purposes. We heard also from Remix that they are developing visualization tool for cities and platforms that integrate collision curve and other data. We also heard from Moveit that they are using it for urban mobility analytics in general, and also for equity in urban mobility with a special focus on women, late night travel, and underserved communities. Finally, we had a presenter from healthcare, the Conduent namely. We heard that they are not, in general, the crowdsourced data is not being used as widely by public healthcare as it's being used by transportation or planning agencies, but there are some noteworthy efforts and practices that are made to leverage the emerging data for public health sector. In second panel, we had the researchers, mainly from the research institutes and the consulting firms, to discuss how the crowdsourced data were being used for transportation data analytics. We had the panelists from TTI, ASU, Arizona State University, Tool Design, and the Streetlight. We heard that the researchers are using data mainly to assess non-motorized user mobility and safety, and key implementation areas were using the crowdsourced data for scaling or developing direct demand models to estimate non-motorized users. Another example along these lines were creating geographically weighted fusion of data sources for bicycle volumes. One another area this data is being implemented is for safety purposes. For example, looking at near misses, as you all might know, getting near miss data is really difficult, which is one of the main incidents that the bicyclists or non-motorized users are usually get involved in. So one of the solutions would be looking at perceived safety by assessing the influences, whether or not people are biking and where they are biking. So these were some very interesting examples that we heard. Also, our panelists discussed how they are using the data for developing the online data portals and maps, although these are not exactly, for example, the first example that's being developed by TTI, we are not still using crowdsourced data, but that is one of the ideas is to see how we could develop maps that would integrate both the ground data, ground bike, pedestrian data, and the crowdsourced data. We also saw another example, bikemaps.org, created by ASU. So we still, despite all of this progress, we're still, there are still some major questions remain about how do we integrate disparate data sources, and then reconciling the differences and the bias in crowdsourced data. Our third panel consisted mainly from data providers from Strava, Lime, and Ride Report. They discussed the data gaps and privacy issues. Sean already talked about a lot of this, so I'm not gonna repeat all of that discussion. But the main issues they had are, like we heard from the data providers, is that there are two main areas, key areas. The one is data collection and handling issues. Some of these important issues in this area are re-identification and redundancy that are very pressing matters for the data providers. They are also trying to come up with standardization and how this data, like to prepare standards for collecting the data so it could be used uniformly. In general, handling the big data was found to be hard. And then finally, paying attention to data provenance and collection methods was mentioned to be a very important issue. And of course, the privacy issues, this is still an ongoing issue. There is a lot of data out there, and the more powerful the data source, there is a greater risk for the individuals. So the data providers have to be very careful. These are the pressing matters for the data providers, but it's also important to know like what is being collected, who owns the data, and what can be done with it. Our fourth panel, we had all the panelists together to discuss the cross-cutting issues. As I said, we had some questions prepared for them. We also received some questions from the audience. This was quite a long discussion, but unfortunately, we didn't have time to discuss the next actions, like what are the next activities. So we mainly just focused on what are the pressing matters, and we kind of divided. I think there were like 4 areas that were that attracted a lot of discussion and questions from the audience. First one was about the communicating the biases and whose responsibility it is to communicate the biases observed in crowdsourced data. We heard from the panelists that there is a need to advocate for the consistent evaluation methods. Also, it's important to report the confidence intervals or margin of error when we're developing, when we're using this data to for the urban mobility analytics purposes, or for providing the practitioner states with number of the volumes of the non-motorized users. As you probably realized, a lot of the discussion were mainly about bicyclists, and we also had some discussion about e-scooters. So pedestrian data, I believe Movit said they are collecting pedestrian data, but in general, this is one of the gaps in crowdsourced data, because the ground truth pedestrian data is very difficult to collect, especially with wide facilities. And also it's very hard to match the pedestrians to a network. So this is still a gap in crowdsourced data. About what is missing right now when it comes to crowdsourced data for non-motorized transportation, we heard that the facility data is one of the missing gaps in crowdsourced data, and governments are in position to facilitate this type of data to users. Excuse me. And finally, we had, TRB being a place for the researchers and, of course, the academia. We had questions about how can academia help the professional workforce, or how the data can be used, provided to academia. For example, capacity building and workforce development, or the companies sharing the data sets for educational purposes were some of the discussions during the cross-cutting issues panel. So that was question, the overview of how this workshop went. As I said, we didn't have enough time to discuss the future actions, but we're hoping to put together a summary which we'll share. We'll hopefully send it to our friends, the TRB, and of all the committees that helped to organize this workshop, and we'll also put it in our website.
Great, thank you. And if you want, you can share that with us, and we'll be sure to pass along as well.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Bahar. That's a great summary and sounds like a great workshop for someone who didn't get to attend. I'm going to, I guess, address a question to you, but also invite the other panelists or maybe even folks that are attending to type in. The question box can be used for responses also. With workshops like these, there's so much great discussion that goes on, and it's hard to capture everything. But I'm wondering if you could share your insights to what you thought might have been one or two of the key takeaways from the workshop, and that could be, you know, this is a pressing research need, or an opportunities we need to share with our colleagues in terms of the amount of emerging data. Any impressions about some of the big picture takeaways?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, especially with this type of workshop where we had people from so many like different backgrounds, and you know, like people mainly focus on their on what they are doing. I think it was like one of the biggest takeaways from this workshop was that we're not alone. We can always try to coordinate and work with others. I think for every area, for example, about the data, we had some main takeaways were that there are some biases in the data, and how this can be addressed. Also, I think like in general, coordination and trying to work together were the main takeaways from this workshop. As for like, I think, yeah, we could probably summarize it based on the panel. Yeah, like especially the issues that we discussed during the cross-cutting panel regarding how to address the biases and what are the main gaps in this data, and then probably about how we can provide data to academia and workforce development.
Thanks, Bahar. Yeah, I think that's such a challenge with a workshop. There's so much that goes on, and as you mentioned, you run out of time at the end of the workshop and don't really get to do the detail in terms of developing next steps. I wonder if any of the other, I mean, Sean, I know you were at the workshop yourself, or again, if any of the attendees had any other insights they wanted to share.
Yeah, Sean, that was a good summary. I would just say it was pretty well attended for having a Thursday morning 4-hour session on the last day of TRB. And we had I think it just speaks to the interest in this topic, and you know, potentially having more of it at the next time we meet.
Excellent. And I'll encourage folks to continue to share those. Right now, I'm going to take a rather lengthy question that Tara Telford sent in, sort of an open-ended discussion. I think it's appropriate for the day because I know we're all having a lot of anxiety with everything that's going on. I'm going to read the whole thing through because it's a long question, but I think it's some good food for thought from the panel and even folks who are listening. From Tara, I have a question for the group, generally for the end of discussion probably, about non-motorized data collection in the time of COVID. Whether emerging or conventional, I run a count program in a largely shut down city. We are supposed to be collecting a bunch of pre-intervention before counts this spring for projects slated to begin later this year, but obviously travel patterns are wild right now. We have tons of people walking and biking, but not to work or school or anywhere they might normally be going. Any advice or thoughts for those who are facing these crazy conditions during what is traditionally a peak count season for many folks? Any ideas how the non-normal data we do collect can be used for some kind of greater good in the aftermath of this crisis? And I think, you know, that's open to everyone. It's a very interesting question. So thanks, Tara.
So Tony, this is Sean. So we will have those numbers, but they're not, we kind of have a lag in our data of about 6 weeks on when we have the data available. So we don't have real-time data. It takes a while for us to process it. So we'll be looking at that issue. Obviously, I'm in San Francisco right now, and there is nobody on the street, but I do see a lot of people walking more so than motor vehicle traffic. So yeah, but I don't know what other people have done in terms of looking at their permanent count data, but would be interested to hear that as well.
Yeah, I think it's certainly unique, and it occurs to me that particularly folks who are in the data collection business, we're so busy trying to normalize data and make sure that it reflects normal activities and patterns. Right now, abnormal is normal. So my response to you, Tara, is, yeah, I think this is great to look at all this data and then think about the stories it's telling. It's probably going to be terrible for looking at before after project intervention because the baseline is going to be very skewed. At the same time, I think looking at the community-wide impact of this sort of thing, it's going to be helpful to tell the story of how people respond. But I'd be curious if other folks have thoughts to share in terms of how they're working around this very unusual travel time.
Yeah, this is Bahar. Just like from the beginning, I was just thinking how this problem, this pandemic, is actually a mobility issue, not just like for non-motorized transportation, but in general transportation. I think it's very like looking at this data that in general, like mobility data, we could probably, hopefully someday to try to understand how this disease starts spreading. I think, you know, I mean, if it wasn't for the like mobility of the population, I mean, probably the disease could have been contained easily. I mean, not easily, probably, but yeah, I think this type of data, like mobility data, can help us to understand how the disease is spreads and how we can make decisions and come up with countermeasures to address these problems in the future, and hopefully try to contain and like the spread of the disease. This is some ideas I've been thinking of how we could use the transportation data in general, and not just non-motorized, but in general transportation, like other types of transportation data also.
Yeah, thanks. Those are great points, Bahar. I think it really speaks to the need to achieve quality data so we can better monitor the changes during a time like this. Elizabeth Stoles has a suggestion that this is an opportunity and we should alert those with mobile equipment and automated counters to get them out in the environment. Florida is considering keeping counters out there during this time by installing all mobile equipment in the field. Certainly an opportunity to look at these impacts. So it's definitely a good idea to be thinking ahead.
Hello, this is Wen Chen from Cal Poly Pomona, and I think this unique pandemic situation gives us some good opportunity to extensively check the impact of remote work, you know, on the travel demand model, and for motorized and non-motorized, you know, for both of them. And also definitely it's a good opportunity for the transportation related agencies to fix or maintain or repair some portion of the highway, you know, also for the active transportation infrastructures and so on.
Yes, thanks, Wen. And then Tomas has offered a suggestion direct to Tara to her question about her intervention. Tomas writes, in theory, you could compare to a continuous count location, ideally several, that is not affected by the specific project. This would allow you to filter out the COVID effect. However, because the virus effect is likely to be massive compared to the effect of your project, I doubt you will be able to produce many meaningful numbers. I think that's a pretty good point, even with controls. Thanks, Tomas. Yeah,
this is Bahar again. Just like talking about this issue as a data analyst. I mean, we can assume that any changes that's going to happen with the mobility of the non-motorized or even motorized users in data analytics, it will be assumed to be an anomaly. So I think the best to deal with it would be to have the COVID as one of the factors, as an intervention factor in any type of model that you are going to be building, even if it beat travel demand or safety model. And that's the way I think you can resolve the issues that you will be observing in your data.
Yeah, a great point. I think it's good to remind ourselves that this transcends biking and walking. All transportation behaviors are an anomaly right now. But also, I think it speaks to the effect of good monitoring and being able to be prepared for resilience for all types of occurrences or emergencies that might happen in communities, and understand how modal shifts can occur to either help or exacerbate issues, if, of course, we collect the data. I'm still open if there are other questions coming in from members of the panel. It looks like we've got a couple of minutes left if there's any pressing things folks want to add on to the conversation.
Hey, Tony, this is Nathan. Just, harping on what everyone has been saying thus far, this is a really great opportunity to, study how this situation just changes the overall transportation network itself, not just including bicycles and pedestrians. So it'll be really interesting to see what sort of research can be developed, and what sort of findings can be had with some of the data that's collected. But I don't see any other questions at the moment. I'll give it a minute or two before we close out here. We are scheduled to end at 4 o'clock. So, Bahar, I will go ahead and rest the screen from you, and I will show my screen, and we will go ahead and close out here. I want to thank everyone today for their questions, for their time in taking part in this session today, in this Conversations with Colleagues session. Thank you, Tony and Wen, for helping with the Q&A portion, as well as, of course, to Sean and Bahar for sharing their knowledge today.
Hey, Nathan, I have a question to you, and to you and Tony. Do you ask this question from Hyun Lei? Would it be possible for you to share these slides with the audience? I mean, maybe I miss it. I just.
Oh, yeah, no, of course. Yes, the slides will be shared with the group, with all the attendees following this, as well as a link to the recording for today's session. So we'll be sure to get all of that information out to the attendees following the webinar. Check your email probably the next couple of days. You'll be getting that information. Thank you for making sure that we address that question. I appreciate that, Win. So
one last thing, Nathan. It looks I'm assuming we have an update that we're still assuming that NatMec will go on June 1st. There hasn't been any talk about postponing or suspending that.
Yes, I have not seen any notices. Last I checked, that NatMec was still on. Oh, I see Sarah's on. Do you want to provide any updates to that?
Hi. Yeah. So as of right now, the situation is, of course, very fluid as we continue to learn more and as agencies and public officials make decisions on things. June is still a relatively far way out. And so we feel like it's too early to make any firm decisions about canceling. So at this point, NatMec is still proceeding as planned. We do have a conference planning committee meeting scheduled for next week, and so we'll be talking more about this as a planning committee. And of course, as soon as we do have any change in information, we'll be sure to let everybody know, as broadly as possible. Of course, if you've already registered and you have concerns, we do have our refund policy listed on the website. You can look into that. But at this point, we're proceeding as planned.
Excellent. Thank you, Sarah. Okay. Well, one last quick note. The next Conversations with Colleagues session is planned to be June 16th at the same time from 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern. And with that, I appreciate, again, everyone taking your time, all the questions. This was a great session. We'll be sure to send a summary of this to everyone. And with that, we will go ahead and end today's session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.